Welcome to the Fairy Frequency channel. Tonight I'll be reading to you from this very creepy book titled Ghosts and Ghastlies. This is a collection of stories by Helen Hoke. And if you've missed any of the previous chapters, you can find them in our original playlist titled Ghosts and Ghastlies. Tonight's chapter is called Old Wine in New Bottles. This was written by John Edgell, in which Jacob Strauss suffers delusions of being followed. His doctor says he is overworked and recommends that he take a holiday. After 3 peaceful days in Paris, Strauss flies to New York and books into a quiet hotel in Manhattan. The first night he wakes suddenly and feels that someone is in his room. When Jacob Strauss knew that something was very wrong with him, his first reaction was to visit his doctor. He went to the surgery, read magazines in the waiting room, and then waited his turn. And then his turn came. The doctor was sitting behind a large desk, fingering his mustache. "Well, Mr. Strauss, what can I do for you?" Jacob Strauss sat down. "I haven't been feeling well," he said. "Naturally," said the doctor. "Can't you be more specific?" "This may sound strange to you," Jacob said, "but I get the odd feeling that I'm being followed around." "Followed around?" The doctor scribbled something on his pad. "Yes, the feeling that someone is walking behind me. That's the only way I can explain it. If I had eyes on the back of my head, I'd be able to see whoever it is. But when I turn round, even when I turn round very quickly, I can't see anything strange." "Do you work hard?" the doctor asked, taking off his spectacles. "Yes. Why, don't you have a holiday? Get away from it all? Take 3 weeks, and go and lie in the sun. If that doesn't cure you, come back and I'll see what I can do then." Jacob Strauss went home. He lived alone in a room at the top of an old-fashioned lodging house. It wasn't a very attractive room, but his work called for a lot of traveling, and there didn't seem to be any sense in having an expensive home. He lay down on the bed. Perhaps the doctor was right. He hadn't had a holiday for 2 years, and he had been working hard recently. Too hard. He laughed to himself. He had first felt that he was being followed about a month ago, when, late at night, he had been returning to his room after a visit to the cinema. He had been a strange sensation. He had felt that someone was walking behind him, watching him, eyes burning into his back. But when he had turned around, there was not a soul in sight. What struck Jacob most was the very realness of the feeling. In his heart of hearts, he knew someone had been following him. A few days later, the same thing happened again, only this time he had been in his own room. He was looking out of the window when all of a sudden he sensed the presence of someone else, someone whose eyes pierced his back. Jacob had turned around, but apart from himself, the room was empty. Now lying on the bed, he felt that he could laugh at himself. The doctor was right. It was simply overwork, nothing more. The very next morning, he telephoned his secretary and told her that he was taking a holiday on his doctor's orders. Make note to a travel agency and arrange to catch a train that night to take him to Paris. After Paris, he might fly to New York, but he didn't want to fix any definite plans. He was going to have a holiday. He might just as well feel free. The train journey was uneventful. He had a sleeping compartment and slept soundly, waking only when the steward called him for breakfast. The steward was German, like himself. "On holiday, sir?" he asked. Jacob said, getting away from it all. He spent 3 days in Paris, walking by the river Seine, enjoying the spring sunshine and the feeling that he was getting better. Free from the strain of his work, he was completely relaxed. On his last day in Paris, he booked a seat on the morning flight to New York. He had never been to the United States and was looking forward to a trip to the trip with some anticipation. He slept badly that night, perhaps because he was excited about the flight in the morning. When he woke, the candy-striped bed sheets were twisted, and some were lying across the floor, as if he had been moving about a great deal in his sleep. But he could not remember having dreamed. When he did dream, he usually remembered it quite clearly in the morning. On the flight to New York, he slept most of the way, waking only when lunch was being served. He enjoyed the sensation of the plane, soaring like a great mechanical bird thousands of feet above the ocean. If the plane were to crash, Jacob thought, it would drop into the ocean and sink like a stone. But it didn't crash, thankfully, and it arrived in New York exactly on schedule. Jacob booked into a hotel in Manhattan. It wasn't an expensive place, since he couldn't afford one, but the service was good, and the food, although a little unusual, was pleasant. That first night in New York, tired by the long flight, he fell asleep at once. He woke suddenly, sometime early in the morning. His room was on the 12th floor, and he was conscious of a very quiet traffic sounds, the whisper of cars that drifted up to him. A neon light flashing from across the street blinked against the wall of his room. Jacob sat up. Why had he woken? He had woken because, out of the furthest corner of his eye, he had seen someone in the room. He reached out and turned on the bedside table, but the room was empty. It was an ordinary hotel room. There was no one in it but himself. He lay down again, sweating, but did not turn off the light this time. He stared up at the ceiling. Could it be true? Even here in New York, thousands of miles from Hamburg, could he still be imagining that he was being followed? He did not sleep again for a long time. The first light of dawn streaked the sky before sleep fitfully came again. When he woke in the morning, he ate his donut and drank his coffee very quickly, and he left the hotel. He walked around the streets of Manhattan, looking at the Empire State Building and other sights, and listening to the unfamiliar sounds. He behaved like any ordinary tourist, but something was gnawing at the back of his mind. He took his lunch in a small restaurant near Central Park and was about to pay the bill when he became conscious of someone staring at him from behind. This time, he thought the best thing was to ignore the feeling, to pretend that it did not exist. But still, he could not prevent a quick backward glance. He noticed a shadow moving in the darkened corners between the curtain and the window. It looked like a shadow thrown by a human being, but there was no one near who could have thrown it. Jacob felt a little sick. Had he imagined it, or had it caught his first glimpse of the thing that followed his every footstep? He hurried out into the street, walking along the lunchtime crowds. He could not shake off the feeling that he was being pursued through the streets. Nervously, he glanced behind him, but all he could see were crowds of fixed and unfamiliar faces. The thing was invisible. He went back to his hotel. In his room, he locked the door, and he sat down in a chair by the window. What did it all mean, he wondered. Was he going mad, or was there really something following him? He looked down into the 3rd Avenue far below. He had always been a calm, reasonable man. He worked hard, certainly, but he had always thought that his nerves were good and that he could stand any kind of strain. But this whole business was beginning to terrify him. Later in the afternoon, he left his room again. He nearly forgot his key. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. Although he was quite alone in the front of the lift, he had the overpowering feeling that someone was standing immediately behind him. When he turned to look, he noticed a shadow against the wall. It was his own shadow. It could only be his own shadow, since there was no one else in the lift. But it was not connected at the feet. It was a different shape. The nose was longer, the shoulders rounder, and the body was thinner than his own. He felt a growing sense of terror. The shadow drifted to the opposite wall. When the lift reached the ground floor, he stepped out quickly and hurried through the foyer. The clerk at the desk called to him, "Mr. Strauss, there's a message for you." "For me?" Jacob asked, surprised. He did not know anyone in America, and so far as he knew, he had told no one of his trip. The clerk handed him an envelope. "You're Mr. Strauss, aren't you? Room 1214? Jacob took the envelope and opened it. It contained a slip of paper, which read, Old wine in new bottles. He tore the paper up and walked on to the street. He mixed and bumped with the afternoon crowds, but even amongst so many people he could not feel safe. He felt exposed to a terrible danger and began to fear a heart attack. What did the message mean? Was he the old wine or a new bottle? He couldn't stop to think. He kept walking, the terror growing inside him until his blood felt dry. He only knew that he was afraid, truly afraid, for the first time in his life. The shadow knew it too. At around 5 o'clock, he went into a darkened bar near Broadway for a drink to steady his nerves. He sat at the counter and drank a glass of whiskey. Some minutes later, he sensed someone sitting at his elbow and he turned to look. Beside him was a very old man in an old-fashioned black frock coat. He was staring dimly at Jacob, as if from afar. "Did you get my message?" he asked at length. The old man tapped his fingers on the table, but no sound came. "What do you want from me?" Jacob asked in fear. His hands were shaking. "I first saw you in Hamburg, just after I died. I've been following you around ever since. You certainly travel, don't you?" The old man suddenly sounded very exhausted. "It was hard to keep up with you." Jacob looked at him. His flesh was pale, translucent, like old parchment drawn across bleached bones. He might have been 100 years old. The barman did not seem to see him. "What do you want from me?" Jacob trembled. The barman addressed Jacob. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Ignore the barman, as he ignores me," said the old man. "Yes, yes. Give me another whiskey," said Jacob, as the barman poured the drink. The old man seemed to begin struggling, but his efforts were to no avail. In a few seconds, Jacob could literally see right through his body. The shadow said, "Remember to forgive me." A moment later, the shape had vanished. The bar stool was empty, and the seat was covered with bits of dust. Jacob swallowed his whiskey and staggered out into the sunlight. He felt very cold and tired. Suppose that he was imagining the whole thing. Just suppose. Then he was sicker than he had realized. He returned to his hotel room and lay down on the bed. He fell asleep for a time. When he woke, dawn was lifting the empty sky. At the foot of the bed, he saw the old man. His body was a shadow, through which the gray light of day shone like a feeble mist. "Hello, Jacob," it said, slowly removing the frock coat. Jacob opened his mouth to scream before he was immersed in the awful blackness he had always known would come. The decomposing body of an old man was found lying next morning in Jacob Strauss's bed. The doctor said he was at least 90 years old and had been dead for some time. Jacob's clothes hung in the wardrobe. The hotel manager could not understand it, and the police did not bother to investigate. There were too many unsolved puzzles. Of Jacob Strauss, nothing was heard again, although the hotel doorman reported seeing a man who looked very like him hurrying from the building early that morning. He had been wearing an old frock coat. If you ever have the feeling of being followed, it could, of course, be your imagination, but it might also be something else. And that is the end of The Old Wine in New Bottles. There he is. Come to listen to bedtime stories. So if you missed any of the previous chapters of this amazing, creepy book, you can find them in our original playlist titled Ghosts and Ghastlies. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Wishing you all a beautiful evening. Sweet dreams, everyone.